At 76 years old, Margaret Wilson never imagined she would spend a cold autumn night standing on a front porch with nothing but a worn suitcase in her hand. The woman staring at her from the doorway was not a stranger, not an enemy, but the daughter she had sacrificed her entire life to raise. For decades, Margaret worked endless hours, skipped meals, sold cherished possessions, and gave every dollar she could spare to ensure her only child would have a better future. She believed that family was forever. She believed that love would be returned. She was wrong. With a single sentence, her daughter shattered everything. "You can't stay here anymore, Mom." Moments later, the door slammed shut, leaving Margaret alone in the rain. Homeless, betrayed, forgotten. But what neither her daughter nor anyone else knew was that Margaret still owned one thing: a dying apple orchard on the edge of a forgotten town. The trees were withered, the farmhouse was falling apart, and the land was considered worthless by everyone who passed it. Desperate, and with nowhere else to go, Margaret returned to the property she had not seen in over 20 years. She expected to spend her final years in quiet poverty among dead trees and fading memories. Instead, within days of her arrival, luxury SUVs began appearing at her gate. Wealthy strangers offered hundreds of thousands of dollars for the land, then millions, then even more. Soon, powerful corporations, investors, and billionaires were locked in a fierce battle to buy the orchard at any cost. As the bidding war exploded across the state, a shocking secret buried beneath the dying trees began to emerge. One that would transform Margaret from a discarded old woman into the owner of one of the most valuable properties in the country. And when the daughter who had thrown her away came running back, begging for forgiveness, Margaret finally faced the question that would change all of their lives forever. Was blood truly thicker than greed? Stay until the end, because this extraordinary story of betrayal, redemption, and a forgotten orchard worth millions proves that sometimes the people who abandon you are the very ones who end up losing everything. The rain fell steadily across the wealthy suburban neighborhood as 76-year-old Margaret Wilson stood frozen on the front porch of the home she had helped pay for. Her trembling hands gripped the handle of a faded brown suitcase while water soaked through her thin coat. Just moments earlier, she had been sitting in the kitchen she used every morning, drinking tea and believing she was spending another ordinary evening with family. Now, she found herself staring at a closed front door. Behind that door was her daughter, Emily Carter, the little girl she had spent her entire life loving, protecting, and sacrificing for. Margaret could still hear Emily's final words echoing in her ears. "You can't stay here anymore, Mom." The sentence had been delivered with a coldness Margaret had never heard before. It was not spoken in anger. It was spoken as if it were a simple business decision. For several long seconds, Margaret remained motionless in the rain, unable to fully understand what had just happened. She had imagined many endings to her life, but never this one. Never being cast aside by the child she had devoted everything to. As she stood there, memories flooded her mind. 48 years earlier, when Emily was born, Margaret had been the happiest woman in the world. Her husband, Richard Wilson, worked long hours at a local manufacturing plant, while Margaret balanced 2 jobs to help support the family. Money was always tight. There were months when she and Richard skipped meals so their daughter could have everything she needed. They never complained. Every sacrifice felt worthwhile whenever they saw Emily smile. Margaret remembered staying awake through countless nights when Emily was sick. She remembered sewing old clothes instead of buying new ones so she could afford school supplies. She remembered working weekends cleaning offices while other families spent time together. Every dollar she earned went toward building a better future for her daughter. When Emily earned a scholarship to college, Margaret cried tears of joy. When Emily graduated at the top of her class, Margaret proudly sat in the audience and applauded until her hands hurt. When Emily launched her career in real estate, Margaret told everyone she met about her successful daughter. And when Emily married Ryan Carter, a confident and ambitious businessman, Margaret believed her daughter had finally achieved the life she had always dreamed of. Several years later, tragedy struck. Richard passed away after a sudden heart attack. The loss devastated Margaret. For months, she struggled to adjust to life without the man who had stood beside her for more than 50 years. The loneliness became overwhelming. During that difficult period, Emily seemed supportive. She visited frequently and insisted that Margaret should not live alone. "Come stay with us," Emily had said. "You're family. We'll take care of you." Those words had brought Margaret tremendous comfort. Trusting her daughter completely, Margaret sold her modest home. Rather than keeping the money for herself, she contributed most of it toward helping Emily and Ryan purchase a larger luxury property. Emily repeatedly assured her that she would always have a place there. "This is your home too, Mom." Margaret believed every word. At first, life under the same roof felt wonderful. She helped prepare meals, folded laundry, watered flowers, and occasionally watched over the house when Emily traveled for work. She tried her best not to become a burden. But slowly, things began to change. The warm conversations became shorter. Family dinners became less frequent. Emily seemed increasingly impatient whenever Margaret forgot small details or moved too slowly. Ryan's attitude grew noticeably colder. Margaret often overheard conversations that stopped the moment she entered a room. Sometimes she caught Ryan staring at her with visible annoyance. Other times she heard whispers about expenses, privacy, and future plans. One evening, as she walked past the study, she accidentally overheard Ryan speaking to Emily. "We can't keep doing this forever." "She's your mother," Emily replied, "and she's living in one of the bedrooms of a house worth millions." Margaret quietly walked away before hearing the rest. For the first time, a painful feeling settled deep inside her chest. She was no longer being seen as family. She was being seen as a problem. Over the following months, the tension worsened. Ryan frequently suggested retirement communities. Emily began bringing home brochures for luxury assisted living facilities. Whenever Margaret politely declined, their frustration became more obvious. Then came the evening that changed everything. The three of them sat around the dining table. No one touched their food. Emily took a deep breath. "Mom, we need to talk." Margaret immediately sensed something was wrong. Ryan remained silent, staring down at the table. Emily explained that they wanted more privacy. They wanted to travel. They wanted freedom. Caring for an elderly parent no longer fit into the future they envisioned. Margaret listened quietly, hoping there had been some misunderstanding. Then Emily said the words that shattered her heart. "We found a retirement facility for you." Margaret slowly shook her head. "No, sweetheart, I'm not ready for that." The room fell silent. Ryan leaned back in his chair. Emily's expression hardened. "What do you mean you're not ready?" "I can still take care of myself." The conversation quickly escalated. For the first time in her life, Margaret found herself arguing with her own daughter. Tears filled her eyes as she begged Emily to reconsider. She reminded her about the promises she had made. She reminded her about family. She reminded her about love. But none of it mattered. Hours later, Margaret's belongings were packed into a single suitcase. And as the rain poured outside, Emily opened the front door and pointed toward the driveway. The daughter Margaret had spent a lifetime protecting looked directly into her eyes and said something she would never forget. "If you won't leave willingly, then you need to leave anyway." A few moments later, the door slammed shut. Standing alone in the darkness, Margaret slowly picked up her suitcase. She had no home, no plan, no one to call, or so she thought. Because hundreds of miles away, beyond a forgotten country road and beneath the shadows of thousands of dying apple trees, an abandoned orchard waited silently for her return, and hidden within that neglected land was a secret powerful enough to change every life connected to it forever. Margaret sat behind the wheel of her aging sedan long after leaving her daughter's house. The windshield wipers pushed away the rain, but they could not erase the pain that clouded her thoughts. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, illuminated only by scattered headlights and the occasional roadside sign. For the first time in decades, she had nowhere to go. Every place she once called home belonged to the past. Every certainty she had relied upon had vanished in a single night. As the miles passed beneath her tires, one memory kept returning. An old orchard, a forgotten piece of land, a place she had not visited in more than 20 years. The property had belonged to her father, Thomas Wilson. After his death, ownership passed to Margaret, but life had pulled her in other directions. Between raising Emily, supporting her husband, and later helping her daughter build a successful future, she rarely thought about the orchard. It had become little more than a distant memory, buried beneath decades of responsibility. Yet now it was the only thing she still owned. By sunrise, Margaret reached the outskirts of the small rural town where she had spent her childhood. Much had changed. New businesses stood where old stores once existed. Roads had been widened. Houses had been renovated. But the farther she drove into the countryside, the more familiar everything became. Finally, she turned onto a narrow gravel road. Her heart tightened. There it was, the orchard. Rows of apple trees stretched across the hillsides, but they looked nothing like she remembered. Many branches were bare. Weeds covered large sections of the property. Several trees leaned at awkward angles after years of neglect. The farmhouse stood in the distance, weathered by time and countless storms. Paint peeled from the walls. Part of the porch had collapsed. The roof sagged slightly in one corner. To most people, it looked worthless. To Margaret, it felt like the last surviving piece of her past. She parked the car and slowly stepped outside. For several minutes, she simply stood there. The morning breeze carried the scent of earth, grass, and aging wood. Somewhere in the distance, birds sang among the trees. Tears filled her eyes, not because the orchard was ruined, but because it was still there. After everything she had lost, this place had remained. Margaret walked slowly toward the farmhouse. Each step brought back memories. She remembered running between the apple trees as a little girl. She remembered helping her father during harvest season. She remembered sitting on the porch, listening to stories while the sun disappeared beyond the hills. Most of all, she remembered her father's voice. "This land is special, Maggie." As a child, she had asked why. Thomas Wilson would simply smile. "One day you'll understand." At the time, she assumed he was speaking about family history or sentimental value. Now, standing before the neglected orchard decades later, she wondered if he had meant something else. The farmhouse was in worse condition than expected. Dust covered nearly every surface. Several windows were cracked. The electricity no longer worked, yet the structure remained surprisingly sturdy. Margaret opened the front door and stepped inside. The familiar scent of old wood immediately surrounded her. Furniture sat exactly where it had been years earlier. A faded rocking chair still occupied its place beside the fireplace. Family photographs hung crookedly on the walls. A clock that had long ago stopped ticking remained frozen in time. Margaret carefully touched one of the photographs. It showed her father standing proudly among rows of healthy apple trees. For the first time since being thrown out of her daughter's home, she smiled. The following weeks were difficult. Margaret worked harder than she had in years. Every morning she cleaned another section of the farmhouse. She repaired broken furniture. She cleared weeds from the yard. She swept dust from rooms that had been abandoned for decades. The work exhausted her aging body, but it also gave her purpose. Each small improvement felt like reclaiming a part of herself. Word soon spread through town that Margaret Wilson had returned. Many locals were surprised. Some remembered her family. Others simply wondered why an elderly woman would choose to live alone in a dying orchard. One afternoon, while Margaret struggled to repair a broken section of fencing, a pickup truck pulled into the driveway. A man stepped out. He appeared to be in his mid-60s, with silver hair, weathered hands, and the calm confidence of someone accustomed to hard work. "Looks like that fence is winning," he said with a smile. Margaret laughed softly. "It certainly feels that way." The man introduced himself as Daniel Brooks. He owned a neighboring property and had lived in the area for most of his life. Over the next hour, Daniel helped repair the damaged fence. He refused payment. Instead, he simply enjoyed the conversation. Unlike many people Margaret had met in recent years, Daniel treated her with genuine respect. He listened carefully when she spoke and never made her feel like a burden. Over time, a friendship began to form. Daniel occasionally stopped by with tools, supplies, or advice about maintaining the property. Margaret found herself looking forward to those visits. For the first time since her husband's death, she no longer felt completely alone. Yet, strange things soon began happening. One morning, while Margaret worked among the trees, a black luxury SUV appeared at the end of the driveway. The vehicle looked completely out of place in the rural countryside. A man in an expensive suit stepped out and approached her. "Mrs. Wilson?" he asked politely. "Yes. I'd like to discuss the possibility of purchasing your property." Margaret frowned. "My property?" "Yes, the orchard." She looked around at the dying trees, the overgrown fields, the aging farmhouse. Nothing about the place suggested value. "I'm afraid you're wasting your time," she replied. "This land isn't worth very much." The man smiled. "I think you may be mistaken." He handed her a business card. Then he made an offer that left her speechless. $500,000. For a moment, Margaret thought she had misheard him. $500,000 for a neglected orchard that barely produced fruit anymore? The offer made no sense. She politely declined and watched as the man drove away. That evening, she told Daniel what had happened. He was equally confused. "No one offers that kind of money without a reason," he said. Margaret agreed. Something was wrong, or perhaps something was being hidden. Neither of them realized that this mysterious visitor was only the beginning, because over the next few days, more luxury vehicles would arrive, more wealthy strangers would appear, and each new offer would be larger than the last. Somewhere beneath the dying apple trees, a secret was attracting powerful people from across the country, a secret worth millions. And before long, the entire town would be pulled into a battle that no one saw coming. The first offer lingered in Margaret's mind long after the businessman left. $500,000 was more money than she had ever possessed at one time in her entire life. Yet the longer she thought about it, the less sense it made. No rational investor would pay such a price for a neglected orchard filled with dying trees and a farmhouse that needed extensive repairs. The following morning, Margaret tried to focus on her usual routine. She watered several young apple trees she had recently planted, cleaned debris from the yard, and spent a few hours organizing old boxes inside the farmhouse. For a short while, she convinced herself that the strange visit had been nothing more than an isolated incident. Then another luxury vehicle arrived. This time, it was a dark blue SUV with out-of-state license plates. A sharply dressed woman stepped out carrying a leather briefcase. Unlike the first visitor, she wasted no time with small talk. "My company is interested in acquiring this property," she said. Margaret crossed her arms. "Why?" The woman smiled politely. "I'm not authorized to discuss that. What exactly does your company do?" "We specialize in infrastructure development." The answer felt carefully rehearsed. Margaret immediately sensed she was not being told the whole truth. The woman then made an offer. $1 million. Margaret nearly dropped the coffee mug she was holding. Less than 24 hours earlier, someone had offered $500,000. Now, the price had doubled. Again, she refused. Again, the visitor left without providing any real explanation. By the end of the week, 3 more groups arrived. Each represented a different company. Each claimed to be interested in the land, and each refused to explain why. The offers continued climbing. $1.5 million, $2 million, $3 million. The numbers became so absurd that Margaret stopped discussing them with most people. Only Daniel knew everything. One evening, they sat together on the farmhouse porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. "This isn't normal," Margaret said. "No," Daniel agreed. "It feels like everyone knows something except us." Daniel stared across the orchard. "Then maybe it's time we find out what they're hiding." The next few days became an investigation. Daniel began speaking with old friends throughout the county. Margaret visited the local library and searched through historical records. Together, they hoped to uncover some clue that could explain the sudden interest in the orchard. At first, they found nothing. Then, strange pieces of information began emerging. One local surveyor revealed that multiple corporations had recently purchased land surrounding the orchard. A retired county official mentioned seeing teams conducting geological studies in the area. Another resident reported spotting helicopters flying low over nearby hills. None of it seemed connected, yet the timing was impossible to ignore. Every road appeared to lead back to Margaret's property. A week later, Daniel arrived at the farmhouse carrying a folder. His expression alone told Margaret that he had discovered something important. "What is it?" she asked. Daniel placed the folder on the kitchen table. "I think one of the companies is connected to a major technology corporation." Margaret frowned. "A technology company wants an apple orchard?" Apparently, Daniel opened the folder. Several newspaper articles described a massive new development project being planned somewhere in the region. The project involved advanced energy systems, data centers, and infrastructure worth billions of dollars. One article mentioned confidential land acquisitions. Another referenced geological surveys, yet no exact location had been disclosed. Margaret felt a knot forming in her stomach. "You think this has something to do with the orchard?" Daniel nodded slowly. "I think the orchard is right in the middle of whatever they're planning." The discovery answered one question, but created many more. If the land was needed for a major development project, why wouldn't the companies simply say so? Why all the secrecy? And why were multiple corporations competing against one another? The mystery deepened 2 days later. Margaret was pruning branches near the eastern edge of the property when the sound of helicopter blades echoed across the valley. She looked up. A sleek black helicopter descended toward a nearby clearing. Dust and leaves swirled through the air as it landed. Margaret watched in disbelief. A helicopter at her orchard. Moments later, a tall, elderly man stepped out. His silver hair was neatly combed. His tailored suit looked more expensive than some houses. Everything about him projected wealth and authority. Several assistants followed close behind. The man approached Margaret with a confident smile. "Mrs. Wilson." His voice was calm and deliberate. "My name is Victor Harrington." Even Margaret recognized the name. Victor Harrington was one of the wealthiest investors in the country. His companies owned everything from energy projects to international real estate developments. The fact that he had personally traveled to the orchard stunned her. "What brings someone like you here?" she asked. Victor glanced around the property. His eyes lingered on the hills beyond the orchard. Then he looked directly at Margaret. "I would like to purchase your land." Margaret almost laughed. "You're a little late. I've had plenty of offers already." Victor nodded. "I'm aware." The answer sent a chill down her spine. He knew about the other buyers. That meant the competition was even larger than she had imagined. Victor reached into his jacket and removed a document. "I'll make this simple." He handed her the paper. Margaret looked down. For several seconds, she couldn't speak. The number printed on the page seemed impossible. $10 million. Her hands trembled. $10 million. For a dying orchard. For land everyone had called worthless for decades. Victor remained completely calm. "My offer is valid immediately." Margaret slowly lifted her eyes. "Why?" Victor smiled. A small, knowing smile, the kind that revealed nothing, because some opportunities are worth far more than people realize. Before she could ask another question, he turned and walked back toward the helicopter. Within minutes, he was gone. The roar of the blades faded into the distance. Silence returned. Margaret stood alone among the trees, clutching the offer in her hands. $10 million. The number echoed through her mind. When Daniel arrived later that evening, she showed him the document. For a long moment, he simply stared. Neither of them spoke. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "Whatever is hidden here." He looked out toward the orchard. "It's worth a lot more than 10 million. Margaret followed his gaze. The dying trees swayed gently beneath the evening breeze. For the first time, she felt certain her father had known something all those years ago. Something important, something he had taken to his grave. And somewhere within the orchard, buried beneath decades of silence, lay the answer everyone seemed desperate to find. An answer that would soon turn a forgotten old woman's land into the center of a multi-million-dollar war. Months later, the orchard looked completely different. The dying trees that once symbolized loss and abandonment now stood as a reminder of resilience and new beginnings. Fresh rows of apple trees stretched across the hills. The old farmhouse had been carefully restored. Children laughed in places that had once been silent. What had started as the loneliest chapter of Margaret Wilson's life had become the most meaningful. The bidding war that captivated the nation eventually ended at an astonishing $85 million. News stations covered the story for weeks. Financial experts debated it. Investors called it one of the most surprising land deals in recent memory. But for Margaret, the money was never the real victory. The real victory came the day she realized that her worth had never depended on what she owned, how much money she had, or whether someone else chose to value her. When Emily returned after the auction, tears in her eyes and regret in her voice, Margaret listened quietly. Her daughter apologized for everything. She admitted her mistakes. She begged for another chance. Margaret did not respond with anger. She did not seek revenge. She simply told the truth. You didn't leave when I became wealthy, Emily. You left long before that. You left when you stopped seeing me as your mother. Those words stayed with Emily long after she walked away. In the years that followed, Margaret used a large portion of her fortune to create scholarships for struggling students, support local families, and build a community center for elderly people who had been abandoned or forgotten. She wanted others to know that growing old should never mean becoming invisible. Daniel remained by her side through it all. Together, they watched the orchard come back to life. Together, they transformed a neglected piece of land into something that would benefit generations to come. As for Emily, she spent many years trying to rebuild the relationship she had broken. It was not easy. Trust, once shattered, takes time to heal. But Margaret never allowed bitterness to consume her heart. She understood that forgiveness and reconciliation were not the same thing. Some wounds leave scars, but scars also remind us how far we have come. One golden autumn evening, Margaret stood beneath the orchard's thriving trees and watched the sunset spread across the horizon. The same land that everyone once called worthless had changed countless lives. Yet its greatest gift had nothing to do with millions of dollars hidden beneath the soil. It had given her back something far more valuable: her dignity, her purpose, and the strength to believe in herself again. Because in the end, the greatest treasure buried beneath that forgotten orchard was never the land itself. It was the woman who refused to give up after losing everything. And perhaps that is life's most powerful lesson of all. Sometimes the people who abandon you believe they are leaving behind someone with nothing. But what they fail to see is that strength, character, and hope cannot be taken away. And when the storm finally passes, those qualities become worth more than any fortune in the world. If this story touched your heart, remember this: never measure a person's value by what they own today. The quietest people often carry the greatest stories, and the most overlooked lives sometimes hold the most extraordinary endings. Months later, the orchard looked completely different. The dying trees that once symbolized loss and abandonment now stood as a reminder of resilience and new beginnings. Fresh rows of apple trees stretched across the hills. The old farmhouse had been carefully restored. Children laughed in places that had once been silent. What had started as the loneliest chapter of Margaret Wilson's life had become the most meaningful. The bidding war that captivated the nation eventually ended at an astonishing $85 million. News stations covered the story for weeks. Financial experts debated it. Investors called it one of the most surprising land deals in recent memory. But for Margaret, the money was never the real victory. The real victory came the day she realized that her worth had never depended on what she owned, how much money she had, or whether someone else chose to value her. When Emily returned after the auction, tears in her eyes and regret in her voice, Margaret listened quietly. Her daughter apologized for everything. She admitted her mistakes. She begged for another chance. Margaret did not respond with anger. She did not seek revenge. She simply told the truth. "You didn't leave when I became wealthy, Emily. You left long before that. You left when you stopped seeing me as your mother." Those words stayed with Emily long after she walked away. In the years that followed, Margaret used a large portion of her fortune to create scholarships for struggling students, support local families, and build a community center for elderly people who had been abandoned or forgotten. She wanted others to know that growing old should never mean becoming invisible. Daniel remained by her side through it all. Together, they watched the orchard come back to life. Together, they transformed a neglected piece of land into something that would benefit generations to come. As for Emily, she spent many years trying to rebuild the relationship she had broken. It was not easy. Trust, once shattered, takes time to heal. But Margaret never allowed bitterness to consume her heart. She understood that forgiveness and reconciliation were not the same thing. Some wounds leave scars, but scars also remind us how far we have come. One golden autumn evening, Margaret stood beneath the orchard's thriving trees and watched the sunset spread across the horizon. The same land that everyone once called worthless had changed countless lives. Yet its greatest gift had nothing to do with millions of dollars hidden beneath the soil. It had given her back something far more valuable: her dignity, her purpose, and the strength to believe in herself again. Because in the end, the greatest treasure buried beneath that forgotten orchard was never the land itself. It was the woman who refused to give up after losing everything. And perhaps that is life's most powerful lesson of all. Sometimes the people who abandon you believe they are leaving behind someone with nothing. But what they fail to see is that strength, character, and hope cannot be taken away. And when the storm finally passes, those qualities become worth more than any fortune in the world. If this story touched your heart, remember this: never measure a person's value by what they own today. The quietest people often carry the greatest stories, and the most overlooked lives sometimes hold the most extraordinary endings.
Thank you for watching my video. Don't forget to subscribe my channel.